When we're young, in addition to our parents, we usually have heroes, sometimes mythical heroes, that we admire and wish we were. And maybe we still do today. It's hard for me to watch Avengers and not want to be any one of those people, because wouldn't that be incredible? Maybe not Hulk, although, I don't know, I'm always angry. That's a pretty, anybody not seen the film? That's a great, I'm not going to ruin it. But we all know the Hulk, right? He's a guy and then he's not a guy, he's a green, you got that? Anybody, that's a spoiler? Really? Okay, well, a few. Anyhow, we learn from an early age that we can become something else. We want to become something else. When you were kids, and maybe let's hear it in the room. When you were kids, did you have a fantasy, a fairy tale character, maybe a superhero that you wanted to be like? Let's hear it. Who was it? He-Man. He-Man. Mr. T? Mr. T, that's awesome. Is he really a... A-Team was awesome. A-Team is incredible. I'm all for it, yeah. She-Ra. Yes. The Beatles, which they're like mythical status, I think, at this point. Nice. Other ones? Claire Huxtable? Oh, that's awesome. I love that. Yeah. Lois Lane. Lois Lane. You know, that's fast. I wanted to be Superman. I did when I was little. And that's actually a great segue. Thanks for working out what we rehearsed. That was awesome. And I did. I wanted to be Superman, and it actually went further for me. I didn't just want to be like Superman. There was a season in my life where I was convinced I was Superman. I'm totally serious. Judging by your reaction, you're like, well, not really. I mean, but yes. Some examples, okay? When I was 7, 8 years old, I would spend hours standing on the fire hydrant in our front yard, jumping off of it and timing my airtime to see if I was getting any closer to flight. And I wasn't, which was frustrating, but I kept trying. And then at some point, I heard from somebody that your body goes through these significant changes in this thing called puberty or puberty, and I thought, oh, that's when they all show up, is the superpowers then. Seriously, this is what I believed. There's one point I was driving in the car with my mom, and I felt like now was the time I needed to level with her. And I remember saying, we were on the way to the store, we were on our way to Lucky's, that was our local grocery store, and I said, hey, Mom, I hate to disappoint you, but I need to tell you something. You're not my mother. I was born on another planet, and that planet is called Krypton. You know, my mom's like, well, it's not quite how I remember it happening. One more example, just in case you don't think I mean what I say. I believed I was Superman. My mom was doing something in our front living room and had a window looking out onto Continental Drive, the street we lived on. And while she was there, she looks out the window and she sees her, I couldn't have been more than 7 or 8, 7, 8-year-old son standing in the middle of Continental, facing down an oncoming pickup truck. And he didn't see me. He wasn't stopping. And thankfully, residential street, he was going slow enough. Mom was able to make it out of the house and do like Hollywood style, grab me, tackle me to the other side of the street. And I don't remember this at all, but the way she tells the story, you know, her heart's racing. She's panicking. And I look at her, cool as a cucumber, and I say, Mom, don't worry. I'm Superman. I sometimes wonder, like, what if Mom, just on a whim, just thought, I'm not going to correct this delusion. You know, what if she hadn't, you know, reinforced reality to me and she'd, you know, said over and over again, my sweet, stupid little boy, you are not Superman. Like, what if she just reinforced it? You know, like, oh yeah, it'll come with time. It'll come with time. Like, what would have happened? I probably would end up in that street again, and the ending would have been far more tragic. You know, this whole series is about identity, and I couldn't help but think about the different identities that I believed I was and still maybe believe that I am today. We're talking for 6 weeks about maybe even our secret identity, the real you. Maybe it's even a secret from you. And we just started last week, so if this is your first week with us, or first week in a long time, or you weren't here last week, it's okay, there's not a lot to catch up on, but it was a really, really important start to this concept. We're going to build off of the foundation of last week for 5 more weeks, okay? I titled the message last week, I Am Me. And what we did was we said, listen, let's confess that this question we all ask, who am I, is almost unanswerable. It's a really complicated existential meta question, and there's not really one answer to that. There's not a simple answer to that. If anything, we can recognize the times that we're not being ourselves, right? When we kind of manage our public profile, we hesitate to say what we really think or how we really feel, or we try to control other people around us because the future's kind of scary and we want to do what we can to create our destiny, right? So those are ways we know that we're not being ourselves. So what would it mean for us to become more of who we really are and spend our maximum energy being who we really are? So we started last week by saying, listen, let's disqualify your past as a definition for who you are. Your past does not tell you who you are. We said that God's grace tells us God is over your past. He's already over your past, and he's just trying to get us over it, okay? So he uses your past to teach you, to invite other people into his grace, but he's not using it against you. He's not using it to define you. You are you, and that's enough to be deeply pleasing to God, loved by him. All right, so who is you? Well, that's what we're going to be talking about for 5 weeks. Today we're going to come up with maybe or look at the most offensive idea that we can talk about in the day and age we live in now. And it's simply this: you are not qualified to lead your own life. And that's challenging for some of us. If not you, then certainly some of the people that you know. Listen, you are not capable of creating your best destiny. You don't have the capacity, the wisdom, the strength, the perspective to be your best leader. We're going to talk about who you give permission, who you give authority to, who you give control of your life to. And I'll just put all my cards on the table. This message this morning, this word to you that I have is simply this: you are God's. You belong to him. That is who you are meant to be. And that might not be where you're at. You're not willing to concede that point. That might be a terrifying idea. Or you might think like, listen, if I really submit myself to that, does that mean I'm submitting myself to a religious practice or a moral code? Or what is this belonging to God? Okay? If you really want a message to go viral, what you want to say is, listen, you are in charge of your destiny. Like, forget all the haters, forget what people say about you, forget your past or your failures. Today is a new day, and let's set your own course. You are Superman. And there's some good and there's some truth in that, which is why I think we're always drawn to it. We're attracted to it. I just pinged a couple of the most common memes that I see around this theme, and maybe this will sound familiar to you, so let's actually put a couple of them up here. Have you ever heard something like, I didn't create this, by the way. Full disclosure, I feel like I have to say that because I don't know who did, but that's maybe not the best first impression. But here we are. The best way to predict the future is to create it. Anybody ever heard that? Yeah? Okay. What about this one? I love this one. When I get sad, I stop being sad and be awesome instead. True story. Which sounds great to me. I've been sad. I'd love to know how to just be awesome instead, but it works for Doogie. Okay, so the next one. If Nicolas Cage can still get work, then you can do anything. I'm crossing some lines here. Maybe you're a personal friend of Nicolas Cage. There will be obstacles, there will be doubters, there will be mistakes, but with hard work, there are no limits. No limits. There are no limits at all. None. No limits. This last one, we'll stop on this one. Amazing thing about life is that you choose what you allow into it. Totally true. You choose how things affect you. Yep. You choose how you react. Happiness is a choice. Make it. It's up to you. This is how you get a message to go viral. You are responsible for your own life. That's true. Nobody can tell you what to do. You have the capacity to lead to the destiny that you desire. That's how you get a message to go viral. What if Pinterest is wrong? Here's the question I want us to consider this morning together, okay? And to some this will be exciting, to some this is threatening. I totally get it. Every kind of person in this room, all right? Here's the question to consider. Who would you become if God was in charge? Who would you become if God was in charge? I want to look at a reflection on the life of Jesus that helps us circle this question together this morning, all right? John was one of the closest friends and followers of Jesus. You've heard of John. He wrote one of the 4 biographies we have. We call it a gospel account. If you're a church person, you've heard that before. Gospel just means good news. It's one of the things I love about our faith is that it's not based on just moral teachings. It's not based on a book. It's not just based on a revelation to some prophet. Christianity began at an event, like something that happened in a day and a time. That's why we call it good news, not good lessons, right? So this is one of the gospel, the good news accounts of somebody who saw what Jesus was capable of. John wrote this biography, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I want you to find John chapter 1 if you have scripture with you this morning. You can find it on your phone or if you have a physical Bible. As always, we're going to put some of the sentences up on the screen so you don't get lost wherever you're at. John chapter 1. And John writes this little prologue to his biography of Jesus. So in some ways, he's saying, this is what, in hindsight, all this means before I tell you what actually happened, all right? And in John chapter 1, Jesus says this little thing in the prologue that is a good starting point for us today when we're considering the idea of how control and authority determines how we see ourselves, determines our identity. Whatever version of the English Bible you have, it says something like this in verse 9, starting in verse 9. The true light, that's one of the metaphors that John uses for Jesus. The true light who enlightens every human being was in the process of coming into the world. He was already in the world, of course. The world was made through him. But the world did not recognize him. It's like John, on reflection, said, well, how did people miss it? Jesus said things that nobody else was saying. Jesus did things that nobody else was doing. How did we miss it? One of the things that John teases out in his biography is that Jesus was claiming to be God in a world that wasn't looking for God. And in that sense, I don't know that we would be any more aware of God showing up today than people were back then. Because we didn't expect him to show up. I mean, let's be honest. Conversations like this are outmoded now. We don't need a concept of God. It worked for humanity for a long time. It kind of helped us develop society, at least in the West. It helped us form some sort of moral behaviors and even laws that we now, all of us can get behind and support. It helped form our collective desire for justice and for mercy. For hundreds of years, people said, well, that's because God has commanded us to do it. But anymore, do we really need God to stand in that place? We can just say this is good human practice. We've discovered so much about the physical world through our physical evaluation, our natural discovery. We don't need God to explain why it's all here anymore. Eventually, we'll figure that out. We figured out so much on our own. We figured out so much without him. All of the internal tensions that we have and struggles that we have, psychology has been this incredible help, made great strides in just developing emotionally healthy human beings without any sort of God concept. So if God exists, he has to prove that he has something more to offer than we already have on our own. So what would it mean for God to show up in a world that's not looking for him? And when I have conversations about the existence of God, and I have them all the time, every week, sometimes I can be accused of using what's called a God of the gaps argument. Anybody ever heard that before, God of the gaps? Yeah. And it comes up a lot when we get to a point in the conversation that I can't answer a question. And then I'll say, well, God fills in some of those blanks for me. Like why do bad things happen in the world if God is so good and he's so powerful? And then I just, something around the idea of like, well, God's ways are just more developed than mine. They're higher than mine, Well, it's convenient for you to say that. It's a way to kind of get out of the conversation, get out of the answer. And so I just want to confess just up front, I absolutely have a God of the gaps, okay? I absolutely have a gap. And I have no problem confessing that because so do you. Everybody has a gap, and everybody puts something in that gap. All right? There's stuff that we just don't know. There's answers. There's questions that we just can't answer, right? But here's what I want us to see. The fallacy in our approach to the world, and this starts to change how we see ourselves, is that we believe that that gap is a leftover. Like we can figure out, we can achieve, we can do so much on our own, and all these things that are inexplainable and all these problems that we can't yet solve, that's our gap. And so for theists like me, for Christians maybe, they say, well, God's ways are higher than mine, I just can't explain it, right? Like God gets the leftovers. And the more that we discover about our world, the smaller the real estate of that gap gets. Like God really doesn't have much left to work with. Here's what I want us to see. That gap does not come at the end. For all of us, whether we know it or not, your gap actually comes at the beginning. Your gap, you might want to call it a presupposition or a conviction about the world. It's how you expect the world to work, or maybe how you want the world to work, or how you were taught the world is supposed to work. Maybe you were raised in a faith community and then you didn't connect the dots as you got smarter and you grew up. And so God just doesn't seem like it fits in that gap anymore. But I'll tell you, whatever you decide to place in that gap of where this all came from and why it's all here, that thing has the greatest authority in your life. That thing tells you who you are. And so if you believe that in that gap is still just more nature, that it's just more physical world, that whatever happened in the beginning, whatever set this whole thing in motion can still be observed and measured with our five senses, then what does that say about who you are? It says that we're here beautifully, chaotically, wondrously as a result of random events, that you are just carbon and chance. So I suppose, you can be whoever you want to be. We can decide to be a decent humanity if we want to, but at the end, we're not really accountable to anybody but ourselves. You have ultimate authority. It's your body. Do what you want with it. It's your money. Do what you want with it. It's your future. Do what you want with it. And that would be logical for everybody. There's some people who say, well, that just doesn't really explain these big questions I have. There must be something extra natural that got the whole thing started, something maybe supernatural, and I don't think natural discovery is going to uncover something but I just don't know what that is, and I don't think anybody can. So it's this God of ambiguity. This God that maybe got the whole thing started, but as far as it affects your life, your Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, you're still kind of on your own. You're still kind of creating your own path. And maybe God has like your best intentions in mind, or your best interests in mind rather, but he doesn't really impose himself on your life at all. And at that point, who are you? You're kind of the designer of your spiritual life, to choose your own adventure. I do have a gap, like everybody else, and I do have a God that sits in that gap, but it's not any God. I have a very specific God who's revealed specific things about himself that lead me to expect certain things about the world and lead me to believe certain things about myself. And that's no mystery. We're in a church, for heaven's sakes. And my God has led me to expect that the universe is observable and functional and consistent because it's intentional. My God leads me to expect that I want to create, and I love stories, and I get enveloped in these kinds of conversations about who am I? I don't think like my dog wakes up in the morning wondering like, who am I in the world? But we do. I have a God that leads me to expect that I think that way, and I have a God that leads me to expect to love and to serve and to respect you no matter where you come from, no matter what you believe, because you're created in the same image of the same God that I am. And I'm not qualified to think any less of you, okay? So my God of the gaps has great authority in my life, but listen, if we're not looking for him, if we didn't expect him to be there, if God was not in our gaps, if he was to show up in your world today, I don't think you'd recognize him either. That's what was happening in the time that John experienced Jesus. But it wasn't just natural thinking that didn't see him coming. It was religious thinking. This is so humbling for me. It was religious thinking too. Religious thinking just misses God all the time. It makes me think, man, I bet I miss God every single day. Religious thinking missed God too. Let's we're just tiptoeing through these couple of sentences here. Go down to verse 11. Verse 11 here in John chapter 1. So he came into his own home, but his own family did not welcome him. What's John talking about? He's talking about people who said, we are looking for God. We're trying to obey God. We are the people of God. They missed him too. I don't know why. You read about the reactions of people to Jesus, religious people, spiritually minded people to Jesus, and you get the sense that maybe they were uncomfortable with how close and personal God was when he showed up. God, I am okay if you want to fix the world, but I am not okay if you want to challenge me. My spiritual life, my religious life so often devolves into something that I can control and manage and grade. It just feels safer, okay? When I feel stuck in my faith, when I feel like I'm not growing in my faith, what kinds of activities do I need to set in motion? If my faith isn't working, then I better start, right? These are the kinds of people, maybe you've been here before, or you certainly know people who are there, who believe for a while that getting deeper in your faith is just collecting more data about the faith rather than putting your faith and love into action. I wonder if those are the same people that just didn't see God when he showed up saying, I want you to love people you don't agree with. I wonder if they didn't recognize God when he said, I want you to forgive people who don't deserve it. I wonder if they didn't see God when he showed up and he said, I'm not going to look like success, I'm going to look like suffering. I wonder if they missed God because their faith life, their spiritual life was so manageable, so contained. God could not surprise them. Who do people believe they are if that's the case? Well, if you're like me, you still think you're Superman. I didn't even mean to be posing like that when I did it. I just realized I was. See, I can't help it. So, every week I give you a little glimpse into how stupid I can be sometimes, how silly I can be. So, this is no exception. I do believe that I am saved. I believe that I'm saved. And I believe that God's love didn't need me to impress him or to measure up to him. I believe that. But man, when it comes to what I do during the week, when I feel tense or when I feel afraid or when frankly, I just feel selfish or when I feel bored, it takes me seconds to take matters into my own hands. To say, well, this is really up to me. When I develop loopholes for my actions, loopholes for my inactions, that's a big one. When I used to really struggle with some addictive habits and I wanted to keep it in hiding for fear of bringing it out into the light where God really does begin to change things. Or when I felt like, my faith was really about my activity, my academic pursuit, my approach, my habits, and I felt like I could grow on my own. That's a big temptation of mine. I'm sure it is for some of you. That I believe that I can grow in my faith and my relationship with God on my own. For a long time, I was told that this is all about a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. So why do I need to be so interpersonal with people? This is hard. I mean, I love community, and there's so many relationships that I get so much out of. But if it's necessary for me to grow in my faith, well, this is not the easiest way to go. It's so much easier for me to just contain and schedule my time. It's predictable. It's messy to do this in community. It's like that in any relationship, right? I mean, if you really want to grow in any relationship, after a while, it just starts to become complicated, and it challenges your assumptions and your desires. I say this every wedding I perform. I say this thing because it's been so true in my own life. Those things that were once really, really charming, that first attracted you to somebody, those little idiosyncrasies that like nobody else does it like that. That's just so cute. No time at all, and that's super annoying. You're laughing because you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's like, oh, I just wish you were more like me. So when God says, well, if you're going to grow spiritually, you've got to do it in community with other people. I'm like, oh my goodness, but they're just not like me. It'd be so much easier, simpler. I don't know about easier, but simpler if everybody was like me. This is the way that I still think at times that I can be Superman. And if I looked at some of my instincts in my spiritual life, the only diagnosis I could really come up with would be, I believe that God got me into this, but I'm getting me through this. You ever feel like that? God came to say, you belong to me. I don't know why I keep doing that, because every time I control something, I destroy it. It just never ends up being as transcendent as I thought it was supposed to be. Faith isn't a miracle anymore. It's boring. It's not as freeing as it's supposed to be. The harder I work, the more anxious I become and afraid. I distort things that I control. And yet I go back there because as trapped as I feel, as stuck as I feel, it just feels safer. It feels safer trying to be Superman over and over again. You see, some of us right now in this room, we're just trying to muster up the courage to allow God to impose himself on our well-manicured world, when all along, God is trying to break into your cell. You see, God is here this morning to tell you, you are not a slave anymore. God is here to tell you, you're not a prisoner anymore. God is here to tell you, you are not an accident. You are not carbon and chance. God is here to tell you, you know what? You're not even Superman. And somebody had to tell you. God is here this morning to say, you are my child. You are meant to belong to me. So here's what Jesus did to a world that didn't see him coming and didn't want him to be there. Verse 12 of chapter 1. Whoever did want him, and there were lots who did, who believed he was who he claimed and would do what he said, he made to be, I love this, their true selves, their child of God selves. Now, I admit that the picture of a father might be loaded for us, okay? And I want to be very sensitive to that tender metaphor that a father figure might be for some of you based on your own experience. And so if I can kind of peel away the cholesterol of how this has been modeled poorly for all of us in some ways, okay? What God is ultimately saying is, no one knows you like I do. No one loves you like I do, and I include you in no one. God is looking at us, and he says this in 1,000 different ways through Scripture. He says it in 1,000 different ways through creation. He says, listen, you are somebody of such incredible potential, somebody of such incredible value. You have such incredible opportunities for influence in this world. It is so incredible that you are not qualified to lead yourself there. You belong to me. And listen, if God was saying you belong to me the way that you have belonged to an employer in the past or the way that some people belong to a slave master, that is a terrifying, threatening concept. But God is saying you belong to me like a child belongs to their daddy. I know what is best for you. I love you. I know you. I see you. You are my child. Let me lead you. Let me lead you. I believe that freedom will always follow the authority of God. Always. I believe your personal freedom, freedom in your finances, freedom in your sexuality, freedom in your relationships, freedom in your future, freedom in life will always follow the authority of God. Always. And so what I want to invite you to do is kind of say a mantra with me in your week and say this over every category of your life. And this might be the one thing that you remember from today, and that's totally fine. It's simply this, something you probably already know, but it's so easy for me to forget this, and here's the mantra. I can have freedom, or I can have control. I can have freedom, or I can have control. When you think about those categories of your life, you think about your relationships, you think about your future, I can have freedom, or I can have control. You are meant to belong to God. My wife, Katie, she shared with me a story yesterday that I believe to be true. I hope it's not apocryphal. I checked on Snopes and all those. It's too bad. Actually, I suppose it's always been the case that you can't believe anything you read and only half of what you see. That's what my dad always used to say. But anyways, I hope this is a true story. There was a young man in Australia, a 23-year-old man. He's a college student and a collegiate athlete. And he, on a whim, just wanted to track down his cousin, long-lost cousin that he hadn't seen in over a decade. And so he tried the typical ways of tracking her down and couldn't. She wasn't online anywhere, and family didn't know where she was. And finally, somehow, he was able to find her. And the reason it was so hard, he discovered, is that she was nearly illiterate at 17 years old and homeless. And when he finally saw her face-to-face, he also found out that she was 32 weeks pregnant. Desperate situation. Absolutely did not know what to do. So this guy, this 23-year-old man, decided to do what any of us would do given the same circumstances. He adopted her. I'm kidding. I don't think all of us would do that given the same circumstances. He adopted her. For the remaining 1 or 2 years of her, life as a minor, so to speak, he took on the responsibility of being a parent to her. So he worked extra jobs to help pay for her rehab and her recovery and education and help, subsidize her. She's caring for her infant, her son, her newborn son in the first couple years of life. And I wrote down one thing he said in an interview I read. And he said, if it's 1 or 2 years of my life I have to put on hold to make sure 2 lives are going to be saved, it's nothing at all. I think he's crazy. I think I hope it works out, but I think he's absolutely nuts. He's got the support of his family and his community. He's not doing it alone, but I think he's nuts. But, I couldn't help but think about God when I read this story. Because if what he has said about me is true, then God is crazy. His love for me, when I would rather reject him, is crazy. The lengths that he would go to save somebody who did not want to be saved is crazy. The amount of patience he has with me when I would rather control my own life day after day is crazy. Imagine if that 17-year-old girl hadn't accepted help, and there's a lot of times people don't, right? She's afraid. She's had some bad experiences in the past. She's afraid of the unknown. And as small as her world might feel to her, it's her world, and she knows what to expect. A lot of doubt, a lot of mystery, accepting help from other people. There's a lot of shame associated with accepting help from other people. And I wonder if that's some of the same reasons you're holding back from God. Maybe not your whole life. Maybe you've already said, I believe that God has saved me, but the rest of my life or some parts of my life, I got to retain control. And why do we do that? We do it because we're afraid. We do it because we'd prefer to serve ourselves. We do it because we're prideful. All sorts of reasons. We do it because we're afraid that if God sees us the way that we really are, he would mock us, that he'd bring us out into the light for all to see, and we would be condemned. I want you to speak into your week this week. I can have freedom or I can have control. I can have freedom or I can have control. So how do we act like our real selves? Not as slaves, not as supermen and women, but as children who belong to God. How can we act like that this week? How can we act more from our true selves? I don't know. What category of your life might be coming to mind? I'm sure for some it's already, I was 10 minutes into this and it's like, oh, I know exactly what God's talking about here. I don't know. Is it your marriage? Is it your relationships? Is it your friends? Is it your future? Is it your finances? Is it your body? I don't know. I don't know what it is. Is it that habit that, listen, even Superman couldn't break? What is it? If you're here and you're like, man, I hope he doesn't say this, because if he doesn't say this specific thing, then I can walk out of that room and just believe that God really wasn't looking at that area of my life. It's that area. Whatever that thing is right there, that's it. I don't know what that is, okay? And I don't know what all the next steps are, but I know the first step, and that's to give back control to God, to abdicate your hold on that thing in your life. Stop making up your own rules. Stop hiding it away. Stop going it alone. God is saying, you are my child, and I will give you freedom in exchange for your control, okay? I don't know what that is. Some of you, don't worry about all those categories. Some of you haven't even taken a first step with God, and you just need to give up your entire life. And listen, I know that you're waiting for God to make sense to you. You might even have to suspend some intellectual tensions that you have, okay? I get it. But you've had to do that your entire life because you know you have a gap. And what I'm asking you to consider, maybe once again or for the first time ever, is to give God that authority in that gap and allow him to explain why you feel the way you do, why you expect the things you expect from this world. Allow him to rule you. And I know that's just a first step, but you're not risking anything to give it a shot because God wants to tell you who you really are once you belong to him. You see, he came to make the slaves free. He came to die a slave to be resurrected a son. He came to do the same for you. I want to share a moment, a scene in a hospital room that I came across some time ago that reminds me of how God has come to a world that didn't think he fit, okay? And it's written by a really famous Yale professor of surgery named Dr. Richard Selzer. And mock me, that's what I do in my spare time. I read silly things like this, but he's a widely published surgeon, brilliant man. But a lot of his published work are memoirs about his experiences with patients. And man, it's great reading to see humanity right in the midst of suffering and difficulty, okay? And there's this one scene that I was immediately reminded of when I came to this scripture of how Jesus came to a world that didn't think he fit. And I want to read it for you here as I close. I stand by the bed where a young woman lies, her face post-operative, her mouth twisted in palsy, clownish. A tiny twig of the facial nerve, the one to the muscles of her mouth, has been severed. She'll be thus from now on. To remove the tumor in her cheek, I had to cut the little nerve. Her young husband is in the room, and he stands on the opposite side of the bed, and together they seem to do well in the evening lamplight, isolated from me, private. Who are they, I ask myself, he and this wry mouth I've made, who gaze at and touch each other so generously, greedily? The young woman speaks. Will my mouth always be like this? She asks. Yes, I say it will. It's because the nerve was cut. She nods and is silent. But the young man smiles. I like it, he says. All at once I know who he is. I understand, and I lower my gaze. One is not bold in an encounter with God. Unmindful of me, he bends to kiss her crooked mouth. And I'm so close, I can see how he twists his own lips to accommodate hers, to show her that their kiss still works. I think God has come into a world that is begging him to fit their well-manicured space. And the thing that is most crazy to me, shocking to me, is that God was willing to do it. To the slave, he became a slave. So that through him, by him, because of him, for him, we may become who we were meant to be. Children of God. You were meant to belong to him. I want to pray. Let me pray with us. God, thank you for your love. God, thank you for not waiting for me to want you to pursue me. God, thank you that you keep at it for people who would rather reject you, dismiss you, ignore you. God, I pray you break down all of our reliance on our intellect and our capacity. God, I pray you break down all of our fear. And God, like only you can do, I pray you detonate our pride. We are born wanting to live for ourselves. So God, unhinge us from the desire to control our destiny, to lead ourselves into our own future. Lift us out of that, Lord, and lift us out of that prison cell. Lift us out of that slavery. Take off those chains. And cause us, Lord, to just run in freedom in this life as your kids. We pray these things not because we're good enough to talk to you, but because of what Jesus has done. So be it. Amen.